So we talk about adventure a lot on the podcast, and there's a reason why I talk about adventure a lot on the podcast, and I want to deep dive into a little bit today, and I'm sure I won't be able to cover all of it in 5 minutes, but I'm going to give my best shot to kind of just expand why adventure is so important. Now, in the context of what we've talked about so far, we've talked about how it's important for your kids and how adventure can be this second language that you use to communicate to your kids and help them understand who they are, just have fun. Great experiences. But the reason why that's impactful and useful is because it's actually we as adults are wired for adventure as well. There's a great book by John Eldredge called Wild at Heart. And this book talks about why men are wired for adventure and that we need this adversity to continue to shape and discover who we are. Because when we're in the edge of adventure, it's when that one moment that you realize that the universe has your back and you're on this edge of figuring something out and you can do it. So my little story about adventure is way back in July of 2020, I went camping with my good friend Dan Zahner, who runs Anthem of the Adventure podcast, which goes all in on what I just talked about of why men need and are wired for adventure. And so he lives and breathes this idea, and this was something we wanted to do, was something I wanted to do. But let me tell you about what happened before I went on an adventure with Dan. Leading up to it, there was maybe like 4 weeks where we were going to go on this road trip from southern Wisconsin all the way up to northern Wisconsin, and it was what was called an overlanding experience, which essentially just means you're going in the backwoods of different areas in a vehicle. And we had a Land Rover, which was his Land Rover. And leading up to it, there was at least 3 or 4 times I called Dan, and I was like, I can't go. I am not a guy who goes into the woods. I am not a guy that does camping. My wife and I did it when we were dating once. It was a half good experience because the first night was great. The second night, we ended up having to go get a hotel room, and it was miserable. And so that kind of just created this fear of camping. And like, yeah, I'm just not a camper. And had I been a camper, I would have been able to enjoy it. So that whole experience was just the universe telling me how I am not good at camping. So leading up to this camping trip last year, I was just like, I am not a camp. What am I doing? Guys like you do not go out and do things like that. Like this was a real thought in the back of my head. And Dan would coach me. He'd be like, yes, you can do it. It's going to be fun. It's going to be great. And that's exactly what happened. It was a 6-day adventure. And man, did I discover more of who I was. Because what I learned when I was put into moments of adversity and tested and to learn things, I realized I was more capable than my mind actually knew. Now, there were a couple moments where we had to solve some problem. A good example was we were going on a lot of logging roads in northern Wisconsin. And there's not a lot of people on these roads because they're logging roads. And you don't always know when the trees fall. And so one of the roads had a tree fall and we couldn't get through. And so you have to stop. You got to figure it out. And instantly, my brain was like, oh, we need to create a lever and lever this tree out of the way. And that way it won't be such a big problem. Now that came from my MacGyver mindset. I've absolutely loved growing up on the original series MacGyver. It's something me and my son will watch in the morning. And it's just a great time. And my mind thinks like MacGyver. I can just take this podcast exists because of my MacGyver mindset of taking random things, putting it together, and talking about fatherhood. Well, in this case, it was just, yeah, this is what you do. You solve the problem and you get through it. It was maybe like a 10-minute stop. Now, in my mind, I would have felt like, yeah, that'll be in like an hour. I don't know how to do that type of stuff. What if we can't get out of there? Then maybe I'll go back and it's just going to be a disaster. Might as well just avoid the whole thing. But I didn't. I leaned in. And I showed up in that moment exactly who I needed to be. And I didn't even have to think about it. It was instinctive. And so that adventure trip really taught me I was more capable than I really was. And so wherever you are at in your dad life or manhood journey, whether you sit behind a desk or maybe you are out with your hands every day, the idea of going into adventure is this idea of understanding where's the edge of your life and how can you go beyond it to really prove how much more you can do, how much more can you get out of life to go where you need to go. And that adventure trip just really opened my heart to a couple different things. It opened my heart to the abundance of life that is really around us because what I learned sitting in a cube and doing the corporate world for so long, you get really tired and you get really forgetful of how abundant life really is. You just think kind of your whole world exists in this little bubble that you're in. But when you're in the middle of nowhere, driving around and there's forests everywhere, you realize there is life everywhere. We're surrounded by life. I am just so busy, I forgot to learn how to enjoy it and see it and feel it. And whether it be the birds, whether it be the wind going through the grass, all of those things are life. And it helped me realize that and feel it on a much deeper level than I was before. So this was my adventure story, but I would love to hear your adventure story. Do you have a similar story like mine where you put yourself to the edge of what you thought you were capable of and adventure helped you learn that you could move that barrier and go much farther? Head on over to Instagram and message me at The Business of Fatherhood, and I would love to hear your adventure story about how adventure opened up a new path for you to be more capable of what you have in your life. And with that, I'll be back again to talk to you tomorrow.